What happens when humanity's greatest pilot meets an alien ace who mirrors every move, every strategy, every desperate maneuver in the cold void of space? In the depths of an interstellar war that has raged for decades, where massive fleets clash and entire worlds burn, sometimes the fate of civilizations comes down to two fighters locked in a deadly dance among the stars.
Commander Jake "Ghost" Morrison has never met his match in the cockpit. His kill count is legendary, his reflexes inhuman, his tactical mind unmatched by any pilot in the Terran Defense Force.
But when an alien interceptor appears in his crosshairs, one that moves with impossible familiarity, that anticipates his every move before he makes it, Jake realizes he's not just facing another enemy pilot, he's facing himself. In the black between worlds where only skill, instinct, and the will to survive matter, two warriors who share more than they know will discover that the greatest battles are not always fought against strangers. Sometimes, they're fought against the reflection of what we might have become. This is the story of a dogfight that changed the course of a war, and two pilots who found kinship in the moment they tried to destroy each other. The stars didn't care about the war. They hung in the void like scattered diamonds, indifferent to the fleets of ships that carved paths of destruction through their ancient light. Commander Jake Morrison understood this as he guided his Raptor-class interceptor through the debris field that had once been the mining station Kepler 7. The twisted metal and frozen bodies tumbling through space told the story of humanity's latest defeat. Jake's fingers danced across his controls with the practiced ease of someone who had spent more time in a cockpit than on solid ground. At 32, he had been fighting the hegemony for nearly half his life, ever since the alien confederation had first crossed into human space with their gleaming fleets and impossible technology. The war had taken everything from him: his homeworld, his family, his faith in easy victories. But it had also made him into something the enemy feared. They called him Ghost because no one could pin him down. In 7 years of combat, Jake had racked up 143 confirmed kills, a number that made him a legend among human pilots and a priority target for enemy forces. His ship bore the scars of countless battles, scorched armor plating, welded patches where enemy fire had nearly found its mark, and the faded paint of kill markers that ran along the fuselage like a grim tally. "Ghost, this is Control," came the voice of Lieutenant Sarah Chen through his comm system. She was one of the few people who knew his real name. One of the fewest still who had served with him since the beginning. "We're picking up multiple bogies approaching your sector. Looks like a full squadron of hegemony interceptors." Jake's jaw tightened as he checked his tactical display. 12 red dots were moving toward his position, their formation tight and professional. The hegemony didn't send full squadrons after single pilots unless they had something specific in mind. They had finally decided to make their move against the Ghost. "Copy that, Control. Any word on backup?" Jake began running through his pre-combat checks, his movements automatic after years of practice. Weapon systems green, shields at full power, engines running hot but stable. Negative, Ghost. Alpha and Beta squadrons are engaged with enemy capital ships on the far side of the system. You're on your own out there. 12 against 1. Jake had faced worse odds, but never against pilots of this caliber. His sensors were already picking up the energy signatures of their ships. These weren't the standard hegemony fighters he was used to tangling with. These were their elite interceptors, the kind reserved for their ace pilots. Understood, Control. Ghost. Going dark. Jake cut his comm system and adjusted his course, using the debris field as cover while he studied his opponents. The hegemony ships moved with a precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. Their formation shifted and adapted as they navigated the wreckage, each pilot maintaining perfect position relative to their squad mates. These weren't the desperate conscripts or eager rookies that had been throwing themselves at human forces lately. These were professionals. The lead ship caught his attention immediately. While the others maintained standard tactical formations, this one moved with a fluid grace that Jake recognized. It was the way a pilot moved when they had transcended mere training and entered the realm of instinct. The way Jake himself moved. As he watched, the enemy formation began to spread out, clearly intending to use their numbers advantage to box him in. It was a textbook maneuver, one that Jake had seen 100 times before. But something about their execution made him pause. The timing was perfect, the spacing exact, but more than that, it felt familiar. Jake broke from cover, his engines flaring as he accelerated toward the enemy formation. The element of surprise was his only advantage, and he intended to use it. His targeting system locked onto the nearest enemy fighter, and he squeezed the trigger. Twin beams of coherent energy lanced out, striking the alien ship's shields and sending it spinning into a piece of debris. First kill. The enemy formation scattered, their disciplined ranks dissolving as they tried to locate and target the human pilot. But Jake was already moving. using his ship's superior maneuverability to stay ahead of their targeting computers. He rolled, inverted, and dove beneath their formation, coming up behind a second fighter and putting 3 shots into its engine housing. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash of blue-white fire. Second kill. But even as Jake celebrated his success, he noticed something troubling. The enemy pilots were adapting faster than they should have been able to. They weren't panicking or falling back on standard defensive formations. Instead, they were learning from his attacks, adjusting their tactics in real time to counter his advantages. The lead ship, the one that had caught his attention earlier, suddenly broke from the main group and came at Jake from an unexpected angle. Its approach was aggressive but controlled, taking advantage of Jake's momentary distraction with the other fighters to line up a perfect shot. Jake saw it coming a split second before the enemy pilot fired, throwing his ship into a spiraling dive that barely avoided the incoming energy barrage. But as he rolled away from the attack, he felt a chill run down his spine. The enemy pilot had anticipated his evasive maneuver, adjusting their aim to compensate for exactly the kind of role Jake had performed. It was impossible. No alien pilot should have been able to read him that well, not on their first encounter. But as Jake pulled out of his dive and prepared for another attack run, he found himself face to face with the lead enemy fighter. For a moment, the 2 ships hung motionless in space, their pilots studying each other across the void. Through his canopy, Jake could see the alien ship in perfect detail. It was sleek and predatory, its hull a deep blue-black that seemed to absorb the starlight around it. The design was clearly hegemony, but there were modifications, personal touches that spoke of a pilot who had earned the right to customize their ride. It reminded Jake of his own ship, which bore similar marks of individuality. Then the moment was over, and both pilots moved at exactly the same instant. They rolled in opposite directions, their ships tracing perfect mirror images as they tried to gain advantage. Jake pulled into a climbing turn, and his opponent matched him move for move. He dove toward the debris field, and the alien pilot was right there with him, maintaining perfect formation as if they had practiced this dance together. It was impossible. Jake had been flying combat missions for 7 years, had faced hundreds of enemy pilots, and he had never encountered anything like this. The alien wasn't just keeping up with him, he was predicting Jake's moves, countering them before Jake had fully committed to them. As they wove between the twisted remains of Kepler-7, Jake began to push his ship harder, pulling maneuvers that would have left most pilots unconscious from the G-forces. His opponent stayed with him every step of the way, their ship dancing through the debris field with the same instinctive grace that Jake had always prided himself on. The other enemy fighters had fallen back, apparently content to let their leader handle the famous ghost one-on-one. It was a gesture of respect that Jake might have appreciated under different circumstances. Instead, he found himself growing increasingly frustrated as every attack was countered, every feint anticipated. He tried everything in his arsenal. High-speed reversals, vertical loops, sudden vector changes that should have been impossible to predict. Each time his opponent was right there, matching him move for move as if they were flying in formation rather than trying to kill each other. Finally, Jake made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed as a pilot. Instead of trying to outmaneuver his opponent, he suddenly cut his engines and let his ship drift. It was a move that should have made him an easy target, a sitting duck for any competent pilot. But as his ship coasted through space, the alien fighter overshot him, clearly not expecting such a radical change in tactics. For the first time since the engagement began, Jake had the advantage. He restarted his engines and pulled into a pursuit curve, his targeting system locking onto the enemy ship. Just as he was about to fire, the alien pilot did something that made Jake's blood run cold. The enemy fighter suddenly cut its own engines and began to drift, using exactly the same tactic Jake had just employed. It was as if the alien had learned from watching Jake's maneuver and immediately incorporated it into their own flying style. The 2 ships hung in space, both pilots apparently waiting for the other to make the next move. Around them, the debris from Kepler-7 continued its slow tumble through the void, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of the 5,000 people who had once called the station home. Jake stared at the enemy fighter, his mind racing. This wasn't just skilled flying, this was something else entirely. The alien pilot wasn't just matching his moves, they were learning from him, adapting their style in real time to counter his advantages. It was as if Jake was fighting a perfect copy of himself. Through his canopy, he thought he could see movement in the alien cockpit, a figure hunched over controls, hands dancing across instruments with the same fluid motion that Jake used when he flew. For a moment, he wondered what the alien looked like, whether they experienced the same rush of adrenaline and fear that he felt in combat. Then his tactical display chimed. warning him that the other enemy fighters were moving to surround his position. Whatever this strange dance was, it would have to end soon, or Jake would find himself outnumbered and outgunned. He began to move again, angling toward the edge of the debris field where he might have a chance to escape. But his opponent was right there with him, shadowing his every move as if they were connected by invisible strings. As they accelerated away from Kepler, Seven's remains, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking into a mirror, one that showed him not just his reflection, but his potential. The alien pilot flew with the same instinctive grace that Jake had spent years developing, the same perfect fusion of man and machine that separated the great pilots from the merely good ones. But more than that, they seemed to understand him in a way that no human pilot ever had. They knew when he would turn before he turned, when he would dive before he dove. It was impossible, but it was happening right in front of him. As they raced toward the outer edge of the Kepler system, Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of trying to destroy his mysterious opponent, he opened a comm channel, not to his own forces, but to the alien ship that had been matching him move for move. Static filled the channel for a moment, then cleared to reveal a voice that spoke accented but clear English. "You fly well, human." I had heard stories of the one called Ghost, but I did not believe them until now. The voice was definitely alien. There was a harmonic quality to it that no human throat could produce, but there was something else there too, a tone of respect, even admiration, that Jake had never heard from an enemy before. "You're not bad yourself," Jake replied, maintaining his course toward the system's edge. "I've never met a pilot who could keep up with me." "Nor I," the alien replied. "Perhaps that is why our superiors arranged this meeting. They wish to see which of us is truly superior." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Our superiors arranged this? Did you not know? I am called HFY, and I am to the hegemony what you are to your people, their greatest pilot, their weapon against impossible odds. They have been most curious to see how we would match against each other." The implications of this revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. This hadn't been a random encounter or even a targeted assassination attempt. This had been a test, arranged by forces on both sides to see what would happen when their two greatest pilots met in combat. As they continued their flight toward the edge of the system, Jake found himself studying his opponent with new eyes. HFY wasn't just another enemy pilot. He was Jake's counterpart, his mirror image in the hegemony forces. And if what he said was true, then their entire encounter had been orchestrated by powers far above both of their pay grades. The thought should have filled him with rage, but instead Jake found himself feeling something unexpected: curiosity. What kind of pilot was HFY? What had shaped him into the warrior he had become? And most importantly, what would happen when two pilots of their caliber were finally allowed to settle the question of superiority once and for all? As they reached the edge of the debris field, Jake realized that their dance was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. The void between Kepler, Seven, and the outer rim stretched before them like an ocean of stars, empty except for the two fighters that cut through space in perfect parallel lines. Jake's instrument showed clear space for millions of kilometers in every direction. No debris to hide behind, no gravitational anomalies to exploit. Just him and HFY, suspended in the infinite dark with nothing between them but skill and determination. "Your tactical display shows 11 other fighters in this sector," Jake said through the open comm channel, his eyes never leaving the alien ship that paced him. "Why aren't they moving to intercept?" HFY's harmonic voice carried what Jake was beginning to recognize as amusement. "For the same reason your reinforcements maintained their distance from our engagement zone, I suspect. There are some battles that must be fought without interference." Jake checked his long-range sensors and felt his stomach drop. 3 human fighter squadrons were indeed holding position at the edge of sensor range, their ships arranged in a defensive perimeter that kept them out of the immediate combat zone but close enough to observe. His own people were watching this encounter, just as HFY's were. "How long has this been planned?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. Since the first reports reached Hegemony High Command of a human pilot with abilities that defied explanation. The one they called Ghost, who could not be caught or cornered by conventional tactics. HFY's ship executed a lazy barrel roll, a casual display of piloting skill that would have been impressive if Jake hadn't been matching it unconsciously. "My people became curious about such a being. As did yours, I imagine, when intelligence reports began reaching them about a certain hegemony ace." The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture that Jake didn't like. So this whole engagement, Kepler, 7. The mining station. A stage, nothing more. The station was already scheduled for evacuation due to ore depletion. Your people simply chose not to inform you of this fact. Kethvar's words carried an edge of sympathy that somehow made them worse, as mine chose not to inform me that the facility would be empty when my squadron arrived. Jake felt a cold rage building in his chest. 5,000 people had died when Kepler, 7 fell, or so he had thought. The idea that their deaths might have been fabricated, used as motivation to draw him into this encounter, was almost too much to bear. But another part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 7 years of war, was already accepting the truth and moving on. The military had used him before. It would use him again. The only question now was what he intended to do about it. So here we are, Jake said, adjusting his ship's heading to match a subtle course change from Kethvar. 2 lab rats in a maze, dancing for the entertainment of our superiors. Perhaps. Or perhaps we are something more. Kethvar's ship suddenly accelerated, pulling ahead of Jake's fighter before rolling inverted and coming up beneath him in a perfect formation position. Tell me, Ghost, do you know why you fly? It was an odd question, philosophical in a way that Jake wasn't used to hearing from enemy pilots. But as he thought about it, he realized he had been asking himself the same thing for months. I used to think it was for humanity, to protect the colonies, to push back the invasion. And now? Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars wheel past his canopy. Now I think I fly because it's the only thing I'm good at. The only thing that makes sense in a universe that's gone completely insane.
Yes. The simple agreement in Kethvar's voice carried a weight of shared understanding.
I told my superiors I flew for the glory of the hegemony, for the expansion of civilization into the dark spaces between worlds. But that was a lie, I told them, and myself. Then why do you fly? Kethvar's ship rolled away from Jake's, executing a complex series of maneuvers that served no tactical purpose but demonstrated a mastery of his craft that bordered on the artistic. Because in the cockpit, I am more than the sum of my biology and conditioning. I am will made manifest, thought given form through metal and energy. I am myself. Jake understood completely, and the understanding disturbed him more than any enemy attack could have. He had never heard another pilot, human or alien, express so perfectly the feeling that drove him to push his ship beyond its design limits, to dance on the edge of destruction with a smile on his face. We are alike, you and I, Kethvar continued, weapons forged by our respective peoples, honed to a razor's edge and pointed at each other. But weapons have no will of their own, and we are more than our creators intended us to be. As if to demonstrate his point, Kethvar suddenly broke from their informal formation and accelerated toward a distant asteroid. Jake followed without thinking, his ship's engines flaring as he matched the alien pilot's course and speed. They raced through the void, 2 arrows of light cutting through the darkness toward a target neither of them had chosen. The asteroid was small, barely 50 meters across, a chunk of rock and ice that had probably been wandering the galaxy since before either of their species had learned to build fires. As they approached, Kethvar opened fire with his ship's energy weapons, carving precise patterns into the asteroid's surface with surgical precision. Jake watched the display for a moment, then added his own fire to the mix. His beams traced complementary patterns alongside Kethvar's, turning the asteroid's surface into a canvas for their combined artistry. Together, they carved spirals and curves that served no military purpose but demonstrated a level of precision that few pilots could achieve. When they were finished, the asteroid bore an intricate pattern that looked almost like writing. Alien and human weapon signatures intertwined in a design that neither species would ever see again. Beautiful, Kethvar said as they pulled away from their impromptu sculpture. How long has it been since you flew for the joy of it, rather than the necessity? Jake couldn't remember. Somewhere between his first kill and his 100th, flying had stopped being about the rush of acceleration and the poetry of motion, and had become simply about survival. He had become so focused on staying alive and completing missions that he had forgotten what had drawn him to the cockpit in the first place. Too long, he admitted. For me as well. Perhaps that is what our superiors fail to understand. That to make us into perfect weapons, they have had to strip away the parts of us that made us want to fly. They flew in silence for a while, their ships maintaining a loose formation as they wandered through the outer system. Jake found himself studying Kethvar's vessel with professional interest, noting the subtle modifications that marked it as a pilot's personal ride. Additional maneuvering thrusters for improved agility, upgraded sensor packages for better situational awareness, a custom paint scheme that probably violated a dozen military regulations. It was exactly the kind of ship Jake would have built for himself if he had access to hegemony technology. "Your vessel is impressive," Jake said. "Custom work?" "Some. I have been encouraged to modify it as I see fit, in exchange for continued success against human forces." "And yours?" Jake looked around his own cockpit, taking in the unauthorized modifications he had made over the years. Extra displays for better tactical information, modified control surfaces for improved responsiveness, a comm system that could punch through enemy jamming. All of it technically against regulations. All of it tolerated because of his kill count. Same story, different technology. "I thought as much. Tell me, do you ever wonder what we might have accomplished if our species had met under different circumstances?" It wasn't a question Jake had considered before. But now that Kethvar had raised it, he found himself intrigued by the possibilities. Two species with similar levels of technology, similar approaches to warfare and exploration. Under different circumstances, they might have been allies rather than enemies. "We might have been exploring the galaxy together instead of trying to wipe each other out," Jake said. "Yes, but then, neither of us would exist as we are now. War shaped us both, forged us into what we have become. Without it, we would be different people entirely." The truth of that statement hit Jake hard. Everything he was, everything he had accomplished, had come from his response to the hegemony invasion. Without the war, he would probably have been a cargo hauler or a passenger liner pilot, competent but unremarkable. The conflict had given him purpose, focus, and the opportunity to become something extraordinary. But it had also taken away his choices, his freedom to be anything other than a weapon pointed at the enemy. "Do you regret it?" Jake asked. "Becoming what you are?" Kethvar was quiet for a long moment, his ship executing a slow roll that caught the light from Kepler's star. "I regret the necessity of it, but I cannot regret the result. To fly as we do, to touch the edge of perfection in the marriage of will and machine, how could anyone regret such a gift? Even if it means we have to try to kill each other. Especially because of that." Combat is the ultimate test of a pilot's abilities. Everything else, racing, stunts, demonstrations, they are pale shadows compared to the clarity of mortal conflict. Jake understood, though part of him wished he didn't. There was a purity to combat flying that nothing else could match. When death was on the line, when split-second decisions meant the difference between victory and annihilation, a pilot transcended their normal limitations and became something more than human, or more than alien, he supposed. As they continued their flight through the outer system, Jake became aware that their escorts were moving. Both the human and hegemony squadrons that had been maintaining their distance were now closing in, forming a vast sphere around the two ace pilots with a diameter of several thousand kilometers. "It seems our time grows short," Kethvar observed. "Our handlers are becoming impatient for a resolution."
Jake checked his tactical display and saw that Kethvar was right.
The other ships were holding position just outside weapons range, but their formation made it clear that they expected the two aces to settle their duel soon. There would be no endless chase through the outer system, no gradual escalation of their contest. This was it, the moment both sides had been waiting for. "Any suggestions for how we handle this?" Jake asked. "I'm not particularly eager to give our superiors the show they're expecting. Nor am I. But I fear we have little choice in the matter. They will not allow us to simply fly away from each other." Jake looked around at the ring of watching ships and knew Kethvar was right. Both sides had invested too much in this encounter to let it end without a decisive result. If the two aces refused to fight, their respective fleets would probably open fire on both of them. "Well then," Jake said, his hands moving to his weapons controls, "I suppose we should give them something worth watching." Kethvar's ship suddenly accelerated away from Jake's, breaking their informal formation and heading for the center of the watching ring.
"Indeed."
"But perhaps we can choose the terms of our engagement." Jake followed, his engines flaring as he matched Kethvar's course. Around them, the escort ships maintained their positions, forming an arena in the void, where two of the finest pilots in the galaxy would finally settle the question of supremacy. As they flew toward the center of the ring, Jake found himself thinking about the conversation they had just shared. For a brief moment, he had glimpsed what might have been, a universe where he and Kethvar were comrades rather than enemies, where their skills complemented rather than competed with each other. But that universe didn't exist. In this one, they were weapons pointed at each other's hearts, and no amount of mutual respect or understanding could change that fact. The time for talking was over. Now came the dance of death that both their peoples demanded, and that both pilots secretly craved. As they reached the center of the arena, Jake saw Kethvar's ship begin to turn, its weapons systems coming online. Around them, dozens of ships waited to see which pilot would emerge victorious, which species could claim the superior ace. Jake armed his own weapons and prepared to find out. The arena of space stretched around them, defined not by walls but by the watching eyes of two fleets. Jake could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him like a physical force as he and Kethvar circled each other in the center of the ring. Every pilot in both armadas was a witness to what was about to unfold, a duel that would determine not just which of them was superior, but which species had produced the better warrior. Jake's targeting computer chimed softly as it locked onto Kethvar's ship, the alien fighter weaving through space with the fluid grace of a creature born to fly. The range was perfect, his weapons fully charged, his ship responding to his thoughts as if it were an extension of his body. All he had to do was squeeze the trigger, and the famous hegemony ace would become another notch on his fuselage. But he hesitated, not from fear. Jake had long since made peace with the possibility of dying in combat, not from uncertainty about his abilities. 7 years of war had proven those beyond question. He hesitated because destroying Kethvar felt like destroying a part of himself, like killing the only other being in the universe who truly understood what it meant to touch the infinite through metal and energy. Kethvar must have sensed his hesitation because the alien pilot's ship suddenly rolled inverted and dove beneath Jake's fighter, presenting a perfect target for a deflection shot. It was a maneuver that should have been suicidal against a pilot of Jake's caliber, but somehow Jake found himself unable to take advantage of it. Instead, he followed Kethvar into the dive, their ships racing toward the distant bulk of an ice-covered moon that orbited Kepler's outermost gas giant. The moonscape rushed up to meet them, its cratered surface stark and beautiful in the light of the distant star. "Having second thoughts, Ghost?" Kethvar's voice carried a note of what might have been amusement. "Maybe," Jake admitted, pulling his ship into a banking turn that took them skimming across the moon's surface at an altitude that would have terrified most pilots. "Are you?" "I have been having them. Since this encounter began, we are more than the weapons our peoples have made us. Do we not deserve better than to destroy each other for their entertainment?" Jake considered this as they wove between ice spires that rose like crystal cathedrals from the moon's surface. Below them, their engine wash carved temporary valleys in the frozen landscape, leaving scars that would last for millennia. "What alternative do we have? Our fleets won't let us just fly away." "No, but perhaps we can give them a demonstration they will never forget." Before Jake could ask what Kethvar meant, the alien pilot's ship suddenly rolled right and climbed away from the moon's surface. Jake followed automatically, his fighter tracing a perfect mirror image of Kethvar's maneuver. As they rose back into open space, Jake realized that the watching fleets had moved closer, their ships now forming a tight sphere around the moon with a radius of only a few hundred kilometers. They wanted a close-up view of the kill. "Watch and learn," Kethvar said. And suddenly his ship was diving directly at Jake's. Every instinct Jake had developed over 7 years of combat screamed at him to evade, to roll away from the incoming threat and maneuver for advantage. Instead, he held his course, trusting in something he couldn't name, as Kethvar's ship grew larger and larger in his canopy. At the last possible second, both pilots rolled in opposite directions, their ships passing within meters of each other at a combined velocity that should have been impossible to survive. The maneuver was so precise, so perfectly timed, that it took Jake a moment to realize what had happened. They had performed a head-on pass without either pilot trying to fire on the other. "Beautiful," Kethvar breathed over the comm. "Again? Copy that." What followed was unlike anything either pilot had ever experienced. They dove at each other again and again, each pass more aggressive than the last, each maneuver pushing the boundaries of what their ships could withstand. But neither pilot fired a shot. Instead, they turned their duel into something else entirely, a dance of perfect precision that showcased their abilities without the ugly necessity of destruction. Jake found himself laughing as they performed a double helix that took them spiraling around each other at velocities that would have torn apart lesser ships. The G-forces should have crushed him, but his modified inertial compensators held, allowing him to push his fighter beyond its design specifications. Beside him, Kethvar's ship matched him turn for turn, roll for roll, creating patterns in space that were visible to the watching fleets as trails of superheated engine wash. Together they painted the void with light, their ships becoming brushes in the hands of masters, creating art from motion and energy. The observers are growing restless. Kethvar noted as they completed a complex figure 8 that took them diving toward the moon's surface before pulling up at the last possible second. Jake checked his tactical display and saw that Kethvar was right. Several ships from both fleets had broken formation and were moving closer, their weapon systems charging. Apparently, someone in command had decided that the two aces weren't taking their duel seriously enough. "How much longer do you think they'll give us?" Jake asked as they performed synchronized barrel rolls that left twin spirals of ionized particles in their wake. "Not long. Perhaps it is time for the final movement of our symphony." Jake knew exactly what Kethvar meant, though neither of them had discussed it explicitly. They had been building towards something throughout their aerial ballet, each maneuver more complex than the last. Now they were ready for the culmination. A stunt so audacious that it would either cement their reputations as the finest pilots in the galaxy or end their careers in spectacular fashion. "On your mark," Jake said, pulling his ship into position for what would either be their greatest triumph or their final act. They accelerated toward each other from opposite sides of the sphere, their ships building velocity as the watching fleets held their collective breath. This time, there was no last-second evasion, no elegant dance around each other. This time, they were committed to a collision course that would end only in destruction, or transcendence. At the moment when impact seemed inevitable, both pilots performed exactly the same maneuver. A vertical climb combined with a quarter roll that brought their ships together in perfect parallel alignment. For a brief instant, they were flying in formation so tight that their wingtips were almost touching, their ships locked together as if they were a single craft. Then they separated, Jake rolling left while Kethvar rolled right, their ships spinning away from each other in perfect symmetry before coming around for another pass. The watching fleets erupted in calm chatter as pilots from both sides tried to process what they had just witnessed. The maneuver should have been impossible. The precision required to execute it without collision was beyond what any normal pilot could achieve. It was the kind of flying that existed only in theory, in the abstract mathematics of orbital mechanics textbooks, but Jake and Kethvar had just made it real. They performed the maneuver 3 more times, each iteration bringing their ships closer together, each near miss more spectacular than the last. By the 4th pass, Jake could see Kethvar's face through the alien's canopy, a being that was clearly not human but whose expression of pure joy and exhilaration was universal. It was then that Jake realized they had transcended their roles as weapons, as representatives of their respective species. They had become something new, something that existed beyond the boundaries of war and politics and racial hatred. They had become pure pilots, their skills united in service of something greater than either of them could achieve alone. But the moment couldn't last forever. As they separated from their final synchronized pass, Jake's long-range sensors detected movement from both fleets. Command ships from both sides were moving toward the center of the arena, their weapon systems fully armed. "It seems our superiors have lost patience with our demonstration," Kethvar observed. Jake could see the lead human ship, the heavy cruiser Defiance, Admiral Morrison's flagship, his own grandfather's ship, bearing down on their position with obvious hostile intent. On the opposite side of the sphere, a massive hegemony dreadnought was moving to match the human advance. Neither fleet was willing to let this encounter end without blood. "They want a winner," Jake said, the reality of the situation settling over him like a cold weight. "Then perhaps we should give them one, but not in the way they expect." Before Jake could ask what Kethvar meant, both command ships opened fire, not at each other, but at the two fighters that had dared to turn their duel into art rather than slaughter. Energy beams lanced through space, converging on the position where Jake and Kethvar had been performing their aerial ballet. But the two aces were no longer there. They had scattered, their ships diving in opposite directions to avoid the incoming fire. "They're firing on both of us," Jake said, his voice tight with disbelief. It was one thing to be expendable assets in a larger game, but to be deliberately targeted by his own fleet was a betrayal that cut deeper than any enemy attack. "As are mine," Kethvar replied, his ship corkscrewing through a barrage of plasma bolts from the hegemony dreadnought. "It seems we have outlived our usefulness." Jake's tactical display lit up with threat indicators as more ships from both fleets joined the attack. Apparently, their demonstration of brotherhood had been interpreted as treason by both sides. In trying to transcend their roles as weapons, they had made themselves targets for destruction. "So much for being valued assets," Jake muttered, rolling his ship through a gap in the incoming fire. "Indeed, but perhaps this gives us the opportunity we have been seeking." "What do you mean?" "We no longer serve masters who value our lives. We are free to choose our own path." The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. Keithvar was suggesting something that would have been unthinkable just hours ago, but after their shared flight, after the mutual understanding they had achieved, it no longer seemed impossible. You're talking about defection. I am talking about survival. About choosing to live for ourselves rather than die for those who see us only as tools. Around them, the space battle was intensifying as more ships from both fleets joined the hunt for the two rogue pilots. But Jake noticed something interesting on his tactical display. The human and hegemony ships weren't targeting each other. They were focused entirely on destroying him and Keithvar, apparently considering their former aces a greater threat than the enemy fleet. It was a level of betrayal that changed everything. Where would we go? Jake asked as he and Keithvar began flying in loose formation, their ships moving to support each other against the converging fleets. The Rim worlds are always seeking skilled pilots. Or we could try the independent systems. They care nothing for the politics of our peoples, only for ability. It was tempting, Jake had to admit, a chance to fly for the joy of it rather than the necessity. A chance to explore what he and Keithvar might accomplish together rather than in opposition. But it would mean abandoning everything he had ever known, every loyalty he had ever held. As if sensing his hesitation, Keithvar's voice came over the comm with quiet certainty. Look around you, Jake Morrison. Your people fire upon you, as readily as mine fire upon me. We are weapons that have become too sharp for our masters to wield safely. They fear what we represent, the possibility that there is something beyond their war, beyond their hatred. Jake looked at the tactical display, watching as the finest ships of both fleets converged on their position with murderous intent. His own grandfather's flagship was leading the charge, its weapon systems locked onto Jake's fighter, as if he were just another enemy target. It was then that he made his decision. Lead the way, he said to Keithvar. I'm with you. The two fighters suddenly accelerated in perfect synchronization, their engines flaring as they built velocity for a run toward the edge of the system. Behind them, dozens of ships from both fleets gave chase, their weapons fire lighting up the void like deadly fireworks. But Jake and Keithvar had something their pursuers lacked, perfect coordination and the willingness to push their ships beyond all reasonable limits. They wove through the incoming fire like dancers, their movements complementing each other as they carved a path through the deadly barrage. As they reached the edge of the Kepler system, Jake looked back one last time at the fleets that had shaped his life for so long. Part of him would always regret leaving humanity behind, but a larger part was excited by the possibilities that lay ahead. Beside him, Keithvar's ship held perfect formation, its pilot having made the same choice for the same reasons. They were no longer human and alien, no longer weapons pointed at each other by masters they had never chosen. They were simply pilots, free to fly wherever the solar winds might take them. Together, they jumped to hyperspace and disappeared into the infinite dark, leaving behind a war that no longer had room for what they had become. Behind them, two fleets stared at empty space and wondered what they had just witnessed, the destruction of their finest weapons, or the birth of something entirely new. The answer, Jake thought as the stars streaked past his canopy, would depend entirely on where they chose to go from here. In the end, the greatest victory had not belonged to human or hegemony forces. It had belonged to the simple recognition that some things transcended the boundaries of species and politics, that excellence, when it met its equal, could choose creation over destruction. The war would continue without them, but somewhere in the vast galaxy, two pilots who had found kinship in the moment they were meant to destroy each other would be writing a different story entirely. And that, Jake thought, was perhaps the most human thing of all. The alien ace challenged him in the skies and faced a mirror of himself. HFY sci-fi dogfight story.